A cold dawn crawled across the German countryside, its pale light spilling over a landscape torn open by years of war. Roofs lay in jagged heaps, chimneys stood like blackened ribs, and the wind carried a faint metallic tang rising from collapsed rail lines and twisted shrapnel buried in the mud. In the distance, a single church bell, its tower half crippled, gave a hollow, accidental clang as the breeze nudged its broken iron heart. It echoed across empty streets, once alive with Sunday laughter, drifting now over a silence thick enough to feel. Spring of 1945 had arrived, but it carried none of its promised rebirth. It only revealed, more clearly, what winter had failed to hide. Along a narrow road scarred by tank treads, the remnants of a small farming village clung to existence. Windows had been blown out months earlier, doors hung loose on bent hinges. Children's toys lay half-buried under soot and dust. And somewhere within that broken maze of stone and memory lived a woman named Elise, though her neighbors, those who remained, barely whispered her name anymore. She moved like a shadow through the ruins, her brown hair tangled from weeks without proper shelter, her cheeks hollowed by hunger that had carved itself into her bones. In her arms she often carried her son, a frail boy just past his 5th birthday, though time had made the distinction meaningless. War years aged the young as brutally as the old. Her child, Lucas, rarely spoke now. Before the bombings, he was the sort who giggled at the clucking of chickens and chased the speckled barn cat down the lane. But that world had collapsed in a single night of fire when American bombers thundered overhead, dropping their payloads across strategic rail yards and, by cruel spillover, the small settlements surrounding them. Records later showed that by early 1945, Allied air raids had intensified to unprecedented frequency, leaving millions of civilians displaced across the German interior. Elise and Lucas were among the countless faces hidden within those statistics, a line item in a war ledger that measured loss by tonnage and territory rather than broken families. Yet Elise still carried herself with a stubborn, almost unreasonable resolve. She had survived the winter by sleeping in a sheltered corner of a ruined barn, wrapping Lucas in the remnants of a cotton quilt she had managed to salvage. For food, she scavenged crumbling cellars, dug through abandoned larders, and traded with neighbors who were barely faring better. Once, she waited 5 hours in a ration line for a few ounces of flour, only to watch the man in front of her collapse from hunger before he reached the front. By March, ration cards were nearly useless. The systems that issued them were dissolving faster than the Reich itself. Still, every morning, she rose with the same ritual. She checked Lucas's forehead for fever. She smoothed his hair. She whispered a promise. Hoot word besser. Today will be better. The words had long since lost their certainty, but a mother spoke them anyway. Hope, after all, was cheaper than bread. On this particular morning, Elise woke to the distant tremor of artillery. It rolled along the ground like a thunderstorm stitched from steel. She pressed Lucas closer, shielding his ears, though the boy barely reacted. He had learned the language of explosions. Distant booms meant marching armies. Nearby cracks meant run, hide, do not breathe too loudly. Elise listened carefully. This artillery was moving fast. The front was shifting again. She stepped out into the cold air. The sky was a thin gray, the color of unpolished pewter. Smoke drifted from the eastern horizon, rising from a rail junction that had been bombed the night before. Already, whispers had spread among the surviving villagers. American troops were advancing. Infantry, armored divisions, supply convoys. Some people feared reprisals. Others dared to hope the nightmare might be ending. The propaganda machine had collapsed weeks ago, leaving behind only rumors and exhausted imaginations. Elise felt no hatred for the approaching soldiers, only fear of the unknown. She had lost her husband on the Eastern Front, though no official notice had arrived. She still imagined him standing somewhere in the snow, calling her name. But she knew, deep down, he was gone. The war had swallowed too many men for hope to survive unscathed. Lucas tugged at her sleeve, his thin fingers trembling from cold rather than fear. "Mama," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Ask Dubrod. Do you have bread?" She hesitated. The last piece of stale bread had been eaten the night before, shared between them though she had pretended she wasn't hungry. Her stomach felt like a clenched fist, but she mustered a gentle smile. Violite finned in where Et was. "Maybe we'll find something." It was the closest she could come to truth. She lifted him onto her hip, wincing at how light he had become, and walked toward the village outskirts. The roads were nearly deserted. Most people stayed hidden, unsure how close the Americans were. Rumors claimed they were only a few kilometers away. Others insisted they were still far off. Elise knew better. War had a particular smell. Burnt rubber, diesel fumes, stirred earth, and today it hung unmistakably in the air. As she reached the edge of a ruined orchard, she saw the first sign, boot prints in the mud. Not German. Broader, deeper, fresh. Her heart began to race. She stepped back instinctively, clutching Lucas closer. For a moment, the world seemed painfully still, the only sound the faint creak of bare branches overhead. Then came the rumble. Low at first, then growing steadily louder. Elise turned toward the forest road, her breath catching in her throat as the silhouettes emerged. American soldiers, helmets bobbing, rifles slung, uniforms caked in days of mud and fatigue. Their faces were unreadable in the morning light, but their posture was wary, alert. They had seen too many traps, too many shells buried under innocent soil. Elise froze. Her knees nearly buckled. She knew she should hide, run, something, but her body refused to obey. The soldiers drew closer, boots thudding on the broken road. One of them spotted her. His hand moved to his rifle. Lucas whimpered. The soldier halted, raising a clenched fist to signal the others. The squad stopped in unison, their breaths visible in the cold air. Elise felt her pulse hammering in her throat. She could taste fear, bitter, metallic, suffocating. For a single, unbearable moment, no one moved. Then the soldier stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, his eyes fixed on Lucas. And with the faintest shift in his expression, barely perceptible but unmistakable, Elise realized something astonishing. He wasn't raising his weapon. He was lowering it. The soldier's boots sank slightly into the wet earth as he approached, each cautious step echoing against the broken walls around them. His uniform, once a crisp olive green, had faded into a patchwork of mud, sweat, and the reddish dust of a dozen captured towns. He looked too young to wield the authority his rifle implied. No more than 22, with a jaw still bearing remnants of boyhood softness. But war had carved sleepless nights beneath his eyes. Elise held Lucas closer, her breath trembling, watching the man's hands as if they were the hands of fate. When he finally stopped a few paces away, he lifted both palms in a gesture so gentle it seemed to contradict the entire machinery of war grinding behind him. "It's okay," he murmured, though Elise couldn't understand the words. His tone, calm and low, needed no translation. Lucas peeked out from the fabric of her coat, his tiny face streaked with dirt. The soldier's gaze softened further, and something shifted in the air, a quiet acknowledgement that whatever orders he carried were suddenly irrelevant in the presence of this starving pair. Behind him, his squad lingered with wary eyes, but their weapons remained lowered, absorbing the delicate tension rather than inflaming it. Elise wanted to speak, but her voice felt lodged inside her chest, trapped beneath days of fear. She could only nod, though even that movement came out stiff and slow. The soldier glanced back at his comrades, then slipped one hand into his jacket. She flinched instinctively, clutching Lucas as though she might vanish into him. But instead of a weapon, the soldier drew out a small, battered tin. He tapped it once with his finger before opening it to reveal the unmistakable glint of chocolate. A ration bar, half melted, crumbling at the edges. For a moment, no one moved. Then Lucas's eyes widened, drawn to the sight like a starving bird recognizing seed after a long winter. The soldier crouched low, lowering himself until his face aligned with the boy's height. He placed the tin gently on the ground and slid it forward, slow enough to seem almost ceremonial. Elise hesitated. Rumors had made their rounds through the villages. Poisoned food, trickery, acts of cruelty. But those stories paled against the visceral ache gnawing beneath her ribs. She could feel Lucas trembling, not from fear this time, but from craving. She guided his hand toward the tin. When Lucas tasted the chocolate, his expression flickered from suspicion to disbelief, and then to fragile joy. It was the first sweetness he had known in months. The soldier exhaled in relief, as though he too had been starving for this moment, starving for a reminder that the world still contained gentleness. Elise watched him closely, noticing the way he studied the boy, as if memorizing proof that kindness could still take root in a place ravaged by hatred. Another soldier stepped forward, a taller man with streaks of grime shadowing his cheekbones. His voice was gruff, but his posture betrayed no danger. He pointed gently toward Elise's coat, then to her thin wrists. She understood his meaning. "Are you injured?" She shook her head, though truthfully, she wasn't sure what counted as injury anymore. Hunger could be a wound. Grief could be a wound. Exhaustion could hollow a person as surely as a knife. The tall soldier reached into his pack and produced a can of condensed milk, tapping its lid before handing it over. Elise accepted it with both hands, her fingers brushing his glove. Something like shame rose in her. Shame at receiving charity from the uniform she had been taught to fear, from the nation she had been told was her enemy. But the shame dissolved the moment she looked down at Lucas, whose face now glowed with a faint, unfamiliar light. The squad gathered closer, forming an improvised circle around mother and child. One soldier, a wiry man with a cigarette tucked behind his ear, kept scanning the treeline for danger, but even he kept stealing glances at Lucas, as though ensuring the boy was real and not some apparition conjured by exhaustion. Another removed his canteen, unscrewed it, and offered it carefully. The water was lukewarm and metallic, but to Elise, it tasted like salvation. As they watched her drink, the men exchanged glances. Not the tactical kind they use in combat, but the silent, human kind that passed between people who recognized suffering they couldn't ignore. The youngest soldier knelt again, pointing to his chest. "James," he said slowly. Then he pointed to Elise, inviting a response. She touched her chest lightly. "Elise." Her voice cracked like thin ice. "Elise." He smiled, genuine, wide, disarming. Then he pointed to Lucas, who whispered his name with shy hesitation. "Lucas." It was the first word he'd spoken in days. James repeated it with a gentle American accent, "Lucas," and the boy's lips tugged upward in a ghost of a smile. The squad chuckled softly. The wiry soldier let the cigarette fall from his ear, catching it midair with a dramatic flourish that made Lucas's smile grow a little stronger. It was a small moment, but in a world engulfed by war, small moments could feel monumental. Then the sound came, a distant mechanical hum, like metal groaning against the sky. A convoy approaching, maybe tanks, maybe supply trucks. The squad stiffened instantly, hands tightening around their rifles. James looked toward the road, then back at Elise with an urgency that erased his boyish demeanor. He motioned for her to step behind the remnants of a wall. She understood. More soldiers meant more eyes, more questions, more uncertainty. Not all encounters in war ended in kindness. She moved quickly, positioning Lucas behind her. The squad fanned out, forming a loose protective barrier. Dust swirled along the road as the sound grew louder, deeper. Elise's pulse hammered. Had she endangered these men? Had she endangered herself by trusting them? James glanced back at her. His expression wasn't fear. It was something sharper, protective, almost defiant. As if he had made a silent vow the moment she spoke her name. The convoy rounded the bend. Elise braced herself. And just before the first vehicle came fully into view, James muttered a single phrase under his breath. Quiet, firm, and meant only for her. Though she couldn't understand the words. But she understood the tone. Whatever came next, he had already chosen a side. At first, Elise thought the convoy would swallow the moment whole, erase the fragile bond formed in the orchard, sweep her and Lucas back into the faceless desperation of war. But the trucks rolled past with a roar that rattled the broken windows and scattered dust into the air. The squad did not move until the last engine faded into distance. Only then did James lower his rifle and exhale the tension clenched inside his chest. He turned to Elise, eyes checking her and Lucas as though the passing of heavy machinery might have physically harmed them. When he offered a reassuring nod, Elise felt her own breath ease, drawn slowly through lungs that had forgotten steady rhythm. The soldiers gathered quickly, speaking in low voices, their accents clipped and hurried. She could not understand their words, but she watched their faces, read the lines of concern etched into their brows, and felt instinctively that something was shifting. James gestured toward the village, then toward the small pack slung across his shoulder. His meaning was clear. We will return. Elise nodded, understanding this sudden promise. Unexpected, improbable, yet sincere. As the squad moved off, she held Lucas tightly, her heart torn between relief and dread. War had taught her that good things often vanished as quickly as they appeared. The next morning, before dawn had fully claimed the horizon, the soldiers came back. Not as conquerors or patrolmen, but as something quieter, gentler, bearers of survival. They approached with the cautious familiarity of men who remembered the terrain from the day before, rifles at ease, boots crunching softly over frost-hardened soil. James led them, carrying a metal pot that steamed faintly in the morning chill. Elise rose from her makeshift patch of bedding inside the barn, startled. Lucas blinked at the sight of them, then scrambled upright, his face brightening with something far too rare, anticipation. James lifted the pot's lid, letting the warm, savory smell of broth drift into the cold air. Elise's stomach twisted painfully at the scent, both grateful and embarrassed. The squad laid out their offerings with quiet ceremony. Hardtack softened in water, a few torn pieces of canned meat, a half loaf of army bread. Nothing extravagant, nothing wasted, but to Elise and Lucas it might as well have been a banquet. As they ate, James crouched beside them, sketching simple shapes in the dirt with a stick, a crude house, a sun, a smiling figure, attempting to coax Lucas into responding. The boy stared for a moment, then pressed his finger into the soil and drew a wobbly line. The soldiers beamed, as if this small motion were an act of triumph. Elise felt warmth rise unexpectedly in her chest, an emotion she had not allowed herself for months. Gratitude so deep it bordered on ache. Over the next week, the visits became routine. The soldiers patrolled the area daily, but each time they passed the village, they returned to the barn. They brought rations when they could, though supplies were thin across the region. Sometimes it was nothing more than a shared cup of watery soup. Other times a precious tin of fruit, one of the few luxuries left in wartime stores. The tall soldier, whose name Elise learned was Carter, repaired the barn door with scavenged boards, muttering under his breath about German winter drafts as though he had lived with them all his life. The wiry soldier, Frank, taught Lucas how to make a bird whistle using only his fingers, a skill that made the boy giggle uncontrollably when he finally managed a faint chirp. Through these quiet acts, something unexpected unfolded. Not friendship. War rarely allowed such simplicity, but a mutual understanding. The soldiers saw, in Elise's unspoken resilience, a portrait of the countless civilians whose suffering never appeared in military briefings. Elise saw, in their rough kindness, that humanity could survive even in the uniforms of those she had been told to fear. But not all moments were gentle. One afternoon, a distant explosion shook the valley, sending a flock of crows spiraling into the air. James immediately scanned the horizon, his voice sharp as he barked orders. Elise grabbed Lucas instinctively, her pulse racing as memories of earlier bombings surged through her mind. The squad formed a protective semicircle around them without hesitation. Minutes later, the echo faded. A blown munitions cache, Carter guessed. Still dangerous, but not targeted. Not today. After the tension eased, James knelt beside Elise, pointing toward the hill overlooking the village. He touched his chest, then hers, then made a sweeping motion, a silent vow that as long as they were nearby, she and Lucas would not be abandoned. Elise swallowed hard, feeling a fragile thread of trust take root inside her. Days blended into a rhythm unexpected in wartime. Lucas grew steadier on his feet. His cheeks filled out. His voice returned in fragments. First a few whispers, then full words, sometimes German, sometimes a halting mimicry of English. The soldiers reacted to every syllable as if he were reciting poetry. Elise watched him closely, her heart tightening with the realization that her son was becoming more responsive to the soldiers than he had been to anyone since before the bombings. It frightened her, and yet it soothed her. He was alive again. That was all that mattered. One evening, as dusk draped itself across the barns and the sky darkened like bruised linen, James arrived alone. His steps were slower, his face heavier. Elise sensed something wrong immediately. He removed his helmet, holding it at his side, and took a seat on an overturned crate. Lucas approached him with a shy grin, offering a small stone he had kept as a treasure. James accepted it, but his smile was strained. He reached into his pack and set down 2 items, a small tin of dried peas and a folded piece of cloth. Elise picked up the cloth carefully. It was a child's scarf, soft wool, pale blue, gently worn but warm. It was the kind of thing a mother would knit when winter approached. She stared at it, unsure how to react. James gestured to Lucas, then pointed toward the distant western road. His expression told the rest. The squad had been ordered to relocate. The visits would end. The fragile sanctuary carved out over the past days would dissolve into memory. Elise swallowed, her throat tightening. She thanked him softly, though the word felt too thin for the enormity of what he'd given them. James rose, hesitated, then reached out and placed his hand briefly on her shoulder. A rare gesture, careful yet firm, carrying the weight of unspoken promises. As he stepped back, Lucas tugged the edge of his coat, eyes wide with confusion. James crouched, whispering something in English that made his voice crack despite the effort to keep steady. He pressed the stone Lucas had given him into his palm, then closed the boy's hand around the scarf. The moment stretched in silence. Then James stood, shoulders tense, and walked toward the fading light. But just before he disappeared beyond the barn's shattered entrance, he paused, turned slightly, and looked back, as though seeing something he wasn't sure he could leave behind. The days after James's departure felt stretched thin, as if time itself had forgotten how to move without the echo of the soldiers' footsteps. The barn returned to its familiar quiet, its walls sighing softly with each shift of the wind. Elise packed the blue scarf carefully inside her satchel, folding it with a gentleness usually reserved for family heirlooms. Lucas clung to it whenever the mornings were especially cold, burying his cheek against the wool as though it held the memory of warmth the world had nearly taken from him. Without the soldiers' visits, the village sank into its usual hush, broken only by the caw of distant crows and the occasional grind of carts hauling rubble away from once lively homes. Yet beneath the silence lay a subtle shift in Elise. The fear that had pinned itself to her ribs for months loosened, not vanished, but changed shape, like a shadow no longer quite attached to the body that cast it. She noticed the change most clearly when she stood at the edge of the orchard, where she and Lucas had first met the squad. The path still bore imprints of their boots, though the wind was trying its best to erase them. Elise knelt beside the tracks, her fingers brushing the hardened mud. A small, unbidden thought surfaced. Maybe kindness leaves traces the world cannot easily wash away. She rose slowly, feeling the weight of hunger, grief, and resilience balanced carefully within her. Lucas tugged her sleeve and pointed toward the hill, murmuring something about James's son. It took her a moment to realize he meant the direction from which the soldiers had always arrived. She lifted him onto her hip, understanding the quiet longing in his gaze, even if he didn't fully understand it himself. Spring advanced with hesitant steps. Allied convoys passed more frequently now, some pausing briefly in the village square to distribute supplies, others sweeping through without stopping. The war's final collapse became a whisper carried by every traveler. Surrenders, broken lines, cities overtaken. By early May, Germany's defeat was official, though in villages like Elise's, the news arrived filtered through weary mouths and uncertain translations. The swastikas had vanished from uniforms, but the scars remained, etched not only into buildings but into the posture of every person who walked those shattered streets. Elise sensed that the hardest part of survival was only beginning. Hunger did not end with the war. It merely changed its uniform. One evening, as the last beams of sunlight spilled across the ruined rooftops, a knock rattled the crooked barn door. Elise stiffened, instinctively shielding Lucas behind her. When she opened the door, she found not soldiers, but an American relief worker, older than James, with gray hair pulled under a battered cap and a clipboard tucked beneath his arm. His German was clumsy but kind. He explained that the army had begun registering civilians for aid distribution, food, clothing, shelter repairs. She hesitated, glancing at Lucas, before stepping forward to sign her name. The man handed her a small cloth bag containing flour, dried beans, and a strip of cured meat. It was more food than she had held in her hands in months. Her voice trembled as she thanked him. He tipped his cap, telling her gently, "Rebuilding takes time, but starts like this." The next weeks brought new rhythms. Relief trucks arrived twice weekly, bringing supplies to a central checkpoint. Neighbors who had once avoided each other out of fear now gathered in quiet lines, sharing whispered stories about lost relatives, homes burned, or letters that never came. Elise began to help translate for older villagers who didn't understand the relief workers' gestures or broken German. Her fluency was in that tucked safely at home. No, this was a piece of cloth she recognized from the barn's repairs, a remnant Carter had used. A strange wave of emotion surged through her, as though the past week's kindnesses were returning in splintered echoes. She stepped forward instinctively, but the convoy moved too quickly, leaving dust where answers should have been. After her shift ended, Elise walked Lucas home along the orchard path. The sun dipped low, casting the world in gold. She paused where the soldiers first found them, feeling the memory rise like a breath held too long. Lucas bent to pick a stone, smooth, oval, glistening slightly from recent rain, and proudly held it up to her. She took it and noticed its weight, solid yet comforting, reminiscent of the one James had kept. She slipped it in her pocket, feeling its presence like a heartbeat she wasn't sure belonged to her or the past. They reached the barn, its door creaking softly. Elise lit a candle, its flame trembling before settling into steady glow. She held Lucas close, feeling his breath warm against her neck. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a future, not grand or certain, but possible. A roof rebuilt, a field restored, a life not dictated by fear. Then, as she set the candle down, a faint sound drifted through the doorway, boots on gravel, perfect, but her presence steadied them. The Americans noticed. One officer asked if she might help at the supply station. The work was simple, handing out bags, checking lists, but it stirred something inside her, a small ember of purpose glowing where helplessness had once lived. Lucas sat nearby during her shifts, playing with stones or drawing circles in the dirt. Sometimes he hummed, a soft, tuneless sound that made the workers smile as they passed. Despite the slow rebuilding, there were nights when Elise lay awake listening to the creaks of the barn's beams. Hunger still whispered at her bones. Memories of bombings returned in waves, rushing through her body when thunder shook the sky or engines growled too close. And always, the face of James hovered in her thoughts. She wondered where he had gone, another village, another patrol, or perhaps a distant front where danger still lurked. She wondered if he remained safe. But wonder was not the same as despair. The fear that once gripped her had softened into something bittersweet, as if part of her heart had been rewoven with a thread of unfamiliar hope. One afternoon, while distributing rations near the village square, a column of American soldiers marched through. New faces, new voices, not the squad she knew. But the sight stirred something deep inside her, and her eyes followed them as they passed. In the last vehicle, nestled between crates of medical supplies, she spotted something unexpected, a familiar blue stripe peeking from under a soldier's arm. Her breath caught. It wasn't the scarf. She had steady, familiar. Elise froze. Her pulse quickened, caught between dread and hope. Lucas's head lifted, eyes wide as he turned toward the sound. A silhouette stood just outside the threshold, framed by the last streak of dying daylight. And though the figure had not yet stepped inside, Elise recognized the posture before the face came into view. Someone who had once lowered his weapon, not out of duty, but out of choice. That's it for today's story. And before you go, please tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.